Thank you very much indeed. So we're really delighted to welcome for the first session this afternoon Sir John Saunders, retired High Court judge who chaired the public inquiry into the 2017 Manchester Arena bomb attack. He's going to reflect on the challenges of the inquiry, its findings and recommendations, and the ramifications which are still playing out. A judicial member of the Parole Board, former member of the Sentencing Council, Sir John presided over a number of high-profile cases, including phone hacking and MPs' expenses, and no doubt he will also offer his thoughts on the current state of the criminal justice system, which we more than touched on this morning. Get those questions coming in, and very interested to see what you'd like to put to him. So John, the title of this summit is Reforming Policing to Deliver Safer Communities. And it's hard to imagine a more important component of delivering safer communities than your inquiry. You know, some of your conclusions, you didn't hold back in the least. Families were failed on every level. Are we safer as a result of the way the government has responded to the inquiry?
Well, I certainly hope so. Monitoring recommendations, making sure those followed are absolutely vital. It is no point at all in having an inquiry without actually dealing with the recommendations and following them. That's been an issue with a number of inquiries in the past. So faults which have gone wrong and recommendations being made, you can find being repeated. That was indeed true of Manchester, because some of the recommendations which were not followed came out of the 7th inquest into 7/7 bombings. And that's not the only one. It may well be that the COVID inquiry is going to decide there were some recommendations which were made a long time ago which were not followed. So monitoring is absolutely vital, and no one starts thinking about it till the end. I hope and believe that we've made some new ground in relation to this. The Institute of Government has complained for some time about the lack of thought which goes into monitoring recommendations and how important it is. I thought it was very important that I did some monitoring within a very short time of the inquiry. So on part one, which was to do with the arena and security there, we monitored those recommendations while we were hearing evidence on part two, and then we monitored the part two recommendations 3 months or so after we'd finished. And the reason for that was twofold. First of all, to make sure that people were actually getting on with it, with our recommendations, because once they're gone and forgotten, something else comes up, which it turns out to be much more important and overtakes it. And we also needed to make sure that the recommendations we had made would actually work. So both those sessions were quite encouraging. That it hasn't been done before except by chairmen on a voluntary basis. And I hope that in future, when you're dealing with my sort of inquiry where recommendations come out, that it's actually followed so the chairman is allowed to follow up. So it wasn't the Home Office's way of doing it at that time. They had a belief that making recommendations was for the inquiry, and then monitoring them was actually for somebody else. They described the separation of powers. I don't understand how that comes about. And of course, the inquiry team, the chairman and their team, actually know why they made the recommendations and what they're trying to achieve.
And presumably feel it sort of personally very deeply.
Well, that's absolutely true. You can't expect someone to go through a 3-year inquiry or whatever and then just forget all about it. Not unless you're moving on to something else, which I'm not. So, of course, you're going to remain invested in that and try and make sure it happens.
I mean, are we fundamentally safe when we go to a public event? Can we trust that we're safe?
I certainly hope so. The answer is that a lot of the recommendations are being carried out. The Manchester Police, for example, we've had feedback. They're really following out the recommendations. Across policing, recommendations such as enabling police constables, ordinary police officers, to know how to deal with heavy bleeding. People would otherwise die, or their airways were blocked up. So one of the most moving things, there were a number of moving things at the inquiry, but one of the most moving things was to hear these incredibly brave policemen on the ground who rushed in there, British Transport Police, Greater Manchester Police. They rushed in there knowing that there could be another bomb there to go off, that they were going into a trap, but they went in because they went in to help people. And they found an absolutely appalling scene, such as like a war. And these really hardened police officers were just devastated by the fact that, first of all, for whatever reason, the paramedics were not coming in, and also they didn't have the training to deal with the emergencies that they wanted to do. They wanted to help these people, and they didn't know what to do. And they were utterly devastated. Seeing them give evidence, however long later, they were in tears, a lot of them, just remembering that awful experience for them. So for me, giving them that sort of training to help them deal with the immediate, the care gap, as it's called, the time between getting the professional medics there and the explosion or whatever has happened, giving them the means to do things instantly was just so important. And as I say, their reactions when they gave evidence were among the most moving things in the inquiry.
We know that Martin's Law, for which Martin Hett's mum, Fegan, who's here with us today, campaigned for, was included in the King's speech. There have been a lot of concerns raised about how that might operate with a number of very different types of public venues. How confident are you of its progress, and what did you make of its inclusion?
So Fegan actually will know more about this than I do. It hasn't gone through. We only dealt with Martin's Law insofar as it applied to places like the Arena, so bigger venues. And we thought that it was actually quite easy to get that on the statute book, because the recommendations we could make were reasonably straightforward. It becomes much more complicated when you're talking about smaller venues or things that are going in my town where I live, in Warwickshire. They have a food market, which they do annually, and they are concerned that they are going to be landed with responsibilities for dealing with things under Martin's Law, which they don't know what they're going to be. So that sort of thing's much more complicated. But in a large arena, it really ought not be that difficult to do it. And I do know that a lot of security companies are doing it. I do know that a lot of arenas have done it. But as was revealed on a recent radio programme, not all of our recommendations are actually carried out in practice. And so it needs someone to really get a grip very quickly.
And in terms of a mechanism to monitor, I mean, obviously there were closed hearings during the inquiry, not least around the mistakes that were made by the security service, by MI5. Will there be an independent mechanism to examine that progress, do you think? Or
well, so it's work in progress. So there are two bits of it. There are the open hearings. The Home Office have set up a team to monitor all the recommendations. They have told me, although it hasn't yet happened, but there will be an independent body who will look at how the Home Office are monitoring the recommendations. Otherwise, the Home Office are marking their own homework. So you need someone who can oversee it, to whom they have to be accountable and publicly accountable. Now, that's more difficult, obviously, with the closed hearings, because we couldn't make known what our recommendations were if they were going to, because that might well mean there's a breach of national security. So the Home Office are monitoring them as well. But again, they have assured me that they are going to find some public accountability. Not that the public accountability body will be able to say, these are the recommendations and yes, they've been followed, because that would be breach of national security. But an independent body can stand up and say, we've looked at this, it's happened. So you can be satisfied with that. For what it's worth, we talked to the security service about the recommendations we made. They were all agreed. Everyone thought they were a good thing. So there is every hope that they've already been carried out. But the families, everybody else, the public, deserves to find somebody independent who looks at them and says they've been done. We did offer to do that. The Home Office were a bit concerned. They don't want inquiries going on forever, perfectly reasonably. They're expensive things. So we said we'd do it for nothing. But at the moment, that offer has not been accepted. But there will be some public body who can say to the public, this has happened.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. We're just going to move on to some wider questions about the criminal justice system and parole, you know, in which you have one of your very many areas of specialist interest. Do send your questions in on Slido for Sir John if you'd like to ask him something. I mean, it's hard to overstate the strain the criminal justice system is under, isn't it? I mean, the rising backlog in cases at Crown Courts, prisons at bursting point, trust in policing at a low ebb. I mean, can safer communities even begin to be delivered against a backdrop like this in terms of the way policing is clearly part of the fabric of that whole picture?
Everyone's crying out for investment. The criminal justice system, law and order, the rule of law has, I think everyone would agree, has slipped down. So the MOJ and the Lord Chancellor's Department is not actually the force within cabinet, I suspect, that it used to be. And of course it's for politicians, not for me, to say where the priorities are between health, education and the rule of law.
Pretty central plank of the King's speech last week though, wasn't it? I mean, that was one of the key areas of announcement.
Yes, because in the run-up to every election, every party, every political party will be talking about law and order, because that's what the public are concerned about. So it's fair enough, but yes, but it's investment. So the buildings, they were crumbling when I was still a judge, and I've been gone from being a judge for 6 years. They were in a terrible state of repair. There is not enough criminal legal aid for good people to be actually doing the defence work as well as the prosecution work. And if you haven't got the buildings and you haven't got the infrastructure, then you're always going to be struggling, I suspect.
It's not just the infrastructure, it's just the judges and the lawyers to work in them too.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's, yes, getting the people to do it and making it work. So it's not always been like that. So it used to work quite well once upon a time. And obviously, COVID has been a real hit. I was interested to hear how Wales had done it so much better than we had. But getting juries to operate during COVID was hugely problematic. You needed 3 courts often for one case. Well, that means that the Old Bailey, which has 16 courts, you can do 5 cases, whereas they would normally be filled with 16. So you can set up Nightingale courts, but it takes a while.
Yeah, so there's a mountain to
climb. And I'm sure they will catch up. New Lady Lord Chief Justice, I'm sure she'll be making sure we all catch up.
Let's just return to some of those key elements of the King's speech. The plans to keep violent prisoners locked up for longer. I mean, you have written quite recently about sentencing, putting a whole question mark on revisiting Schedule 21 for sentencing. Perhaps you could just talk me through that.
So Schedule 21 is actually an extraordinary story. It came into the 2003 Criminal Justice Act. Do you mind me going through the history? Is that right? Briefly?
I will do that sort of orderly thing of saying, if you can do it in about a minute.
No. So I'll skip the history of it. But Schedule 21 came into the 2003 Act, mainly because David Blunkett was upset about the fact that the power of giving the minimum sentence to people convicted of murder and getting life sentences was taken away from the Secretary of State, where it had been, and given to judges who actually heard the case and knew something about it. He therefore introduced Schedule 21, which dramatically increased minimum terms. I mean, just dramatically. So you could get a 19-year-old in London, part of a gang, who, perhaps because he was the youngest of the gang, was the one sent out with the gun to shoot one of the opposition. In those days, for life, he would get a minimum term to serve of 16. After Schedule 21 came in, which was not till 2005, he'd be serving more, getting on for 30. So people, and these, from my experience in the parole board, and this is very much personal experience, I'm not representing anybody by this, but you can see 19-year-olds coming up for parole who've done 16 years. They are different people. They are now 35. And since these changes, they're not coming out till 50, 55. And now we're going into whole life sentences more and more. Really, because it sounds like a good soundbite? The Bishop of Gloucester, who is lead for the Church of England on prisons in the House of Lords, along with many other organisations who are interested in sentencing, are saying what we need is a sensible discussion. I don't actually welcome at all the increase in whole life sentences. There will be people here perhaps who do.
It's very difficult for, I mean, which politicians are going to row back from that position?
Yeah, no, they're none of them going to. I mean, in the explanation for the King's speech and the increase in whole life sentences, it explains it by saying the only proper penalty for some murders is whole life. What does that mean? It's completely proper penalty. Do we really want to... Many years ago, Lord Phillips, who was then Lord Chief Justice, came and talked in Birmingham, and he was saying, and this is good 20 years ago, our prisons are becoming old folks' homes. We've got prisons trying to cope with people who in the community would be in a care home, being dealt with professionally. It takes up huge resources. And those people who get whole life sentences will be there for the whole of their life.
Okay.
And £25,000 a year, is it, or is it 50? That it costs us to keep, I think it may be 50,000 a year, a prisoner in prison. So can we just have a rational discussion? Can we all look at what the advantages and disadvantages are? Do none of us believe that if someone has committed a really horrible crime, he can never, ever be rehabilitated? Rehabilitation is meant to be an object, it's statutory, an object of sentences. It has to be looked at by judges when sentencing.
Okay.
If you're giving whole life, you're not taking much account of rehabilitation, are you? And you can be doing it to someone in their early 20s. Sorry.
No, don't. Please don't apologise. It's fascinating to listen. I mean, I suppose one of the things, I was listening to an interview with Justice Secretary Alex Chalk yesterday, and he was pointing towards the lower end of sentencing, saying that they're finding different ways of, not least using tech, some of the things that are available now for the law to use that can actually shift things for sentencing around different parts of the justice system. But that's really interesting. I'm keen to take some questions from the floor. If there's anybody who would like to raise their hands here, we'll get a microphone to them. If not, I'll just go straight to Slido, because I think people are just sticking them on there anyway. Penelope Gibbs has a question for you, Sir John. There's been a steady sentence inflation in England and Wales across the board. Is this about justice or retribution? I mean, just...
Well, that's absolutely the point which I should have made and would wish to make. Whenever someone's let out who's been inside for, say, 40 years, who's committed some hideous crime that we just cannot contemplate how they could do it, everyone says, well, you can't let them out because they did something perfectly awful 40 years ago. And we are just now becoming a retributive society. And we have not been that before. There is no other justification for many of the whole life sentences they're asking for except retribution. And should that be the whole basis of our sentencing? Is that a civilized way to operate?
It's interesting. I mean, I just know from just stories that I've covered in the past, there will be some that would argue that actually when you reassess, perhaps around something like a domestic murder, for example, where there is now greater understanding how that may come about, and that has moved on exponentially, hasn't it, since sort of 2015 in particular, that there is a moment where people will say, hang on a minute, was that addressed in the correct way in the first place, given we have a different understanding for something like domestic homicide? Isn't there a question there of a reassessment, a psychological take? That it's not necessarily about retribution, it's about a better understanding of the initial crime and offence.
Okay, so the parole board, they were also about people who've got life sentences. They won't be let out until the parole board says they are safe to be released. And the failure rate for the parole board of people recommitting serious offences is incredibly low when they've committed serious offences. The people who commit more offences more quickly are those who come out at half-time automatically, nothing to do with the parole board, automatically released at 50% of the sentence. So we do look at that, and the parole board is really hesitant about letting people out when you can't understand why they did the crime in the first place. So they won't get let out.
Interesting.
So you just have to... So, yeah, we do understand things better, hopefully.
Really?
But I'm not sure that necessarily means to people being locked up for longer. But can we just look at it again? So if someone's got a whole life sentence, can we at least after 25 years say, let's have a reassessment? and see whether it's actually necessary to be spending all that money over the next years.
So interesting to listen to you, Sir John. Just a couple of quick questions. One from Jonathan Jardine, who actually asked a couple of questions. Is there a need for judicial protocol to better define the relationship between PCCs and the wider criminal justice system, including the judiciary? That's an interesting point, which I'm sorry to lob that one in, Jonathan.
No, it's perfectly right. I mean, I'm not sure. Police and Criminal Crime Commission had started before I retired as a judge, but we didn't particularly come across them.
Yeah.
I mean, it may be that I was a local judge in Birmingham. I'm not sure that then we did have police and crime commissioners, but whether they're getting in touch and communicating with their local resident judges in their town, it's a very important thing I think that they should do, and there should be communication between them, because apart from anything else, police and crime commissioners have the material to be able to tell judges, this is really prevalent in this area. This is the sort of thing you need to be watching out for, or we've got this problem or that problem. So they are part of the criminal justice system, and they should all be involved.
Kelvin Menon, beg your pardon, Kelvin, is the threat of imprisonment a deterrent?
Okay, so wasn't it interesting looking at those statistics, if you were bearing in mind them with deterrence? So knife crime, judicially, the sentence has got increased enormously. The minimum term, if you kill someone using a knife, went up from 15 to 25. And at the same time, knife crime has, if anything, increased. So the academic evidence, research done, says deterrents do not work. You're the deterrent. The main deterrent is actually getting caught. And if someone before they went out to commit a crime thought, I'm going to get caught, they almost certainly wouldn't do it. But they think they get away with it, therefore they're not considering the sentence. So it's not proved deterrent. I mean, it was interesting to hear, wasn't it, the minister today say, knife crime, double it, twice the sentence. And we all say, gosh, that's good. But what actually is it going to achieve if it doesn't act as a deterrent?
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. Question from Squeaky Door.
I'm not answering this one.
Squeaky Door would like to ask, why the emphasis for courts to operate in physical buildings? We live in the 21st century, but His Majesty's courts appear resistant to change, especially when it comes to embracing modern tech.
Okay, really interesting. The parole board went completely remote. And it kept up. It didn't have a backlog caused by it at all. And they're still doing it remotely because, you know, what's the point of us trying to go into a prison? It causes inconvenience for everyone. So almost all parole hearings now are remote. Not everyone, but almost all. How do you get a jury to operate remotely? 12 different locations. They've all got to be able to talk to each other. It's regarded, rightly or wrongly, as being important for people to see the witness, not over a screen. I agree it may be possible, but it's quite complicated and quite difficult to do. To go in 12 people's homes on a jury, having the judge separately, technically difficult, but maybe.
Maybe. Okay. Just one quick question also about the Victims and Prisoners Bill. And we chatted about this before, Sir John, which potentially would give ministers the power to stop the parole of worst offenders. The Justice Secretary would have a veto over parole board decisions. What do you make of that? And could it contravene the ECHR?
I'm not sure you need to go as far as the ECHR, probably. They're going to have to be quite careful. So the way parole hearings work at the moment, the prisoner is legally represented. If the minister, if the Secretary of State feels strongly about it, he can be represented and can oppose it. So you're now going to have, or the idea is, you have one of, and both sides can appeal. So there is an appeal system within the parole board where a judge within the parole board looks at what happens and decides whether there's been a fundamental mistake. So it can go back really quickly, and these things are done in a couple of months. I mean, it's just really very quick. And that's been used by the Secretary of State. He's done it on something like 40 occasions since he came in, and he succeeded on about 12 of them. They've gone back. If he doesn't like the result there, he goes to the High Court where there's a right of appeal. It seems to me odd that one side in a two-sided argument, can have a complete veto on the result, which is what and then another route of appeal through some other body would have to be put in place. The parole board view is it's not necessary, and actually that's got to be right.
Okay, thank you for that. We're out of time. We've covered so much ground already, but we've got the new DPP here tomorrow for his first sort of public interview. Given the state of the criminal justice system, big question marks, of course, for the CPS2 within that framework, what would you ask him first? What would you like his priority to be?
I think his priority has got to be being completely independent and making, obviously from the police's point of view, and I understand this perfectly well, quicker charging decisions are absolutely necessary to move the system through it. I think for everybody, we need to be looking carefully at how we deal with, I'll call them victims in court, complainants. I mean, I know there's an objection to that from some judges, but we all know what we mean. But people who've made a complaint, who then need to be interviewed by the police in a thoroughly humane way, they then need to be treated by the CPS in a thoroughly humane way. They need to be told quickly what's going on, and they need to have a decision quickly about what's going on. And then when they get to court, they need to be treated properly by everybody, including people like me. But that applies to both sides. Everybody has to be treated properly within the court and within the judicial system.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Sir John, for your time this afternoon.
No.
We seem to have, to talk about the inquiry too, that, you dedicated so much of your life and time to, and I know with great thought for the families involved too. It was fascinating to hear that, and some insights into the challenges faced by the criminal justice system. Thank you very much indeed.
Good.